walk like an Egyptian. All of this, I repeat, seems to me curious, obscene, terrifying, and unfathomably mysterious. James Agee, let us now praise famous men. The step pyramid at Saqqara is the first Egyptian pyramid. It is the physical boundary marker of the Egyptian dynasties. While Narmer is considered the first pharaoh and is assigned to the first dynasty, he and his immediate successors were buried in mastabas, large tombs to be sure, but tombs nonetheless. They had none of the grandeur of the pyramids, and more importantly, little of the astronomical and ritual associations so familiar from books, movies, and speculations about Egypt and Egyptians. This all began in the Third Dynasty, the period that ushered in the Old Kingdom, and which led eventually to the Great Pyramid of Khufu in Giza in the Fifth Dynasty. Why this sudden interest in building pyramids? Why this application of enormous resources towards what was, after all, just a place to bury a corpse? Why did Djoser feel the need to erect this massive structure? Can you imagine doing the same today, no matter how important or powerful the human being? This was a little more elaborate than, say, stuffing Jimmy Hoffa into an oil drum. Or that scene in Goodfellas, where Ray Liotta, Robert De Niro, and Joe Pesci are burying a mob hit in the New Jersey countryside. Hey, what do you like, the leg or the wing? In our time of cinematic deaths by the millions, and novelistic murders and deaths in the millions more, death has lost some of its supernatural aura, and burials are largely an afterthought, something to be gone through, and not the focus of too much attention. A service relegated to funeral homes and overcrowded urban cemeteries. In our era of democratic institutions, it is hard to imagine anyone deserving such a massive mausoleum, but they do still exist. Cesar Chavez, the controversial president of Venezuela, has been preserved in a sarcophagus like a pharaoh. So has Kim Il-sung of North Korea and Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam. And in Moscow and Beijing, there are large tombs for Lenin and Mao, respectively. And while they are nowhere near the size and grandeur of the simplest Egyptian pyramid, they are impressive by modern standards. In both cases, the bodies have been preserved and rest in specially designed and maintained sarcophagi, like pharaohs. The Mao mausoleum is oriented on a straight north-south axis, but the Lenin mausoleum entrance faces northeast. The Lenin mausoleum is notable in this context, for it deliberately was designed in imitation of Djoser's step pyramid. This odd fact should give us pause. It can be agreed that ancient Egypt in the time of the pharaohs was a totalitarian state, like the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China in the 20th century. Lenin and Mao were the pharaohs of their time and place, but they were communists, which by definition means they were atheists. The mausoleums, through whose doors millions have passed, and their carefully preserved bodies in crystal coffins, have nothing to do with religion as we understand it. One can make an argument for secular religion, but that seems beside the point when we are dealing with such an overt display of bodies that have been dead for decades, in Lenin's case, almost 100 years. In countries where religion and religious sentiment are seen as counter-revolutionary and decadent, the erection of mausoleums such as these and the preservation of the bodies suggest there is another purpose at work. Unconsciously, perhaps, those in positions of authority decided that the physical shells of these men should survive forever. In Lenin's case, There was the added precaution of a tomb that was built according to Djoser's design. In fact, it was the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1923 that inspired the Soviet leaders to create a similar everlasting artifact, and was probably the reason why the tomb was designed to look like the step pyramid. It was to be a monument to Soviet science, as much as a demonstration to their own people of the longevity of the revolution and its most important leader. These are impulses that are just as strong in communist and violently anti-religious regimes as they were in ancient Egypt, with all its talk of gods and the underworld and immortality. If we strip the dogmas and the theologies from the mere facts of the preserved bodies and the functional mausoleums, what is left is a technology. Or, as Lenin himself put it, all human conceptions are on the scale of our planet. They are based on the pretension that the technical potential, although it will develop, will never exceed the terrestrial limit. If we succeed in establishing interplanetary communications, all our philosophical, moral, and social views will have to be revised. In this case, the technical potential become limitless, would impose the end of the role of violence as a means and method of progress. V.I. Lenin, in a conversation with H.G. Wells, 1920. For those who may be concerned that I am overstating the significance of the Lenin angle, I submit the fact that the first ever radio broadcast directed at a potential extraterrestrial civilization was the November 19th through 24, 1962 transmission to the planet Venus by the Soviet Union. The message was in Morse code and consisted of 3 words, M-I-R, or peace in Russian. Transmitted on November 19, L-E-N-I-N, and S-S-S-R, which is the phonetic English equivalent of the Russian C-C-C-R, or in our spelling, USSR, both transmitted on November 24th, 1962. One wonders how the Venusian was supposed to know Morse code, but it was a start. For years after his death, Lenin was eulogized heavily. He was often identified with the stars in the sky, or as a guiding star looking over Russia, or as a new sun in the heavens, concepts that would be very familiar to the ancient Egyptians. Of course, much of this is typical poetic imagery, but remember the degree of censorship in the Soviet Union, and the fact that all print media was subject to government control and supervision. At the same time, the Russian Orthodox Church was being suppressed. The cathedrals closed or turned into museums or government buildings, and priests imprisoned or forced into hard labor, all while the secular religion aspect of Lenin worship was approved by the state, as was, of course, his preserved corpse and the Step Pyramid Mausoleum. To make the transition from mere human to an immortal god complete, in 1932, the Russian artist Kazimir Malevich offered his sculpture of Lenin atop a skyscraper designed as a spaceship, pointing to the heavens. Here was the ultimate parabola of the revolution, Lenin as rocket. Imagine for a moment the reaction of an ancient Egyptian priest to the Lenin mausoleum and the preserved corpse of the communist leader. You would have recognized the construction of the tomb, of course, since it is a deliberate imitation of Djoser's. He may have been confused as to its orientation, however, and wondered to which star in the heavens it was aligned. He would have been astonished at the degree of preservation of the corpse, which far exceeds anything the mummification process could produce, until he looked more closely and realized that the body was not mummified, but embalmed, and that the integrity of the body, its viability as a device for entering immortality on the long voyage to the stars, was damaged. Lenin's body had had its arteries severed and the blood drained from it, and that meant that pumping formalin through it in the normal embalming procedure was not possible. Formalin, the combination of formaldehyde and alcohol or water, was injected instead into various organs of the body, a less than optimal solution. Every 2 years or so, the body is removed from its sarcophagus, and the whole process repeated, with the result that less and less of Lenin's body is preserved. A plastic compound is used to compensate for those areas that have not survived. This, to an Egyptian priest, would have been unacceptable. The mummification process preserved as much of the original body as possible, and the embalmers of Lenin's body were determined not to allow mummification to take place. They were seeking an alternative that would allow the body to be viewed as if it was sleeping rather than dead, a cosmetic agenda rather than a resurrectional one. We have taken the time to describe the differences and similarities between the Lenin step pyramid and the original, in order to emphasize the purpose of the Egyptian resurrection machine. The appearance of the body was immaterial to the Egyptians. What was important was that the body was intact, at least insofar as its musculature and skeleton were concerned. Naturally, they could not leave the heavy organs in place, so they were removed and placed in what are called canopic jars. These jars, 4 in number, were hermetically sealed and placed next to the mummy at the time of its internment. The body itself was dried out with natron and then covered in bitumen and other substances that would retard decay for a very long time. The idea was to remove as much water as possible from the body. This had the unexpected benefit of allowing the DNA to survive much longer than would be possible otherwise, enabling genetic researchers today to recover DNA from the body of, for instance, King Tutankhamun. Further, high levels of radioactivity have been discovered in the pyramids, leading Robert Temple to suggest that this also may have contributed to the amazing state of preservation of the mummies. Embalming fluid, on the other hand, accelerates DNA decay, and it is only recently that some methods have been devised that would make it possible to recover DNA from embalmed tissue. Thus, we have to ask why the Egyptians went to all this trouble, when it would have been easier to simply bury the bodies the usual way. They may not have intuited the necessity of preserving DNA, so that the body could, at some later date, actually be cloned. But they did understand that it was necessary to preserve as much of the original body's capacity for walking and talking and copulating as possible. The organs were similarly preserved. So was it with a view towards enabling some future scientist priest to reassemble the body and reanimate it? As mentioned before, reanimating the body was the reason behind the opening of the mouth ritual. The Egyptian priests were not stupid. They knew that the corpse in front of them was not going to get up and walk suddenly or speak with them. The ritual had an enabling function, however, and that was to encourage or permit the conscious element of the individual to take up residence in the body. If the body's mouth was opened in this world, then it was enabled to speak and eat in the next. The body of the deceased, properly prepared, was a tangible link between this world and the Egyptian double world. The priests performing the funerary rituals and all the rituals that took place later in front of the Ka chapel, rituals that continued to feed the Ka of the pharaoh and otherwise maintain it, were mission control. The pyramid was the launch vehicle, The pharaoh was the astronaut, literally a traveler to the stars. And the pharaoh, as a mummy, was in hibernation for the long journey home. Sleep like an Egyptian. A stairway to heaven shall be laid down for him, that he may ascend to heaven thereon. Pyramid Texts, Utterance 267. Space travel has its own peculiar requirements and effects. As the twin problem of relativity demonstrates, any sort of travel close to the speed of light would result in a strange circumstance. The twin who traveled aboard a spacecraft for perhaps 2 years before returning to Earth would find that he had only aged those 2 years, but his twin, left behind on Earth, would have aged 30 years. This is demonstrated by the special theory of relativity, which deals, among other things, with the way we experience time. What if this had occurred in ancient Egypt? Let us say that there had been contact between the Egyptians and an extraterrestrial with a device for space travel that included a ship and a launch platform. The ET decides to take an Egyptian on a trip to the stars, to inspire or terrify her. In order to do so, the ET places the human in a state of torpor, meaning a kind of suspended animation or hibernation for the long trip. The other Egyptians see the process, or parts of it. They try to fit what they are seeing into some context with which they are familiar. Their friend appears to be dead, but they are assured that she will come back to them. She is contained within a glass coffin. There are strange markings on the coffin. Politely, the ET asks the Egyptians to leave as he makes preparations for takeoff. They stand back and watch as the ET enters the device. They can't see what is happening behind the walls and doors of the launch platform, but there is a shimmering of some kind, and then everything goes still. And that's it for 30 years. She is believed to be dead after all this time. Her parents grow old and die. Her friends age. In 30 years, a lot has happened. And then, the launch platform begins to shimmer once again, as it had so long ago. A door opens, and she steps out looking exactly the same as when she left. But her parents are gone. Many of her friends have died or moved to some other city. Those who know her are amazed. She is no longer human. She can't be. She has not aged in 30 years. She has been frozen in time. Her twin sister, bent with age, gray-haired, bewildered, reaches out and touches her sister's face, gently, in awe. There is only one explanation. She has become immortal. The old priests check their notes from 30 years ago, unfold the papyrus scroll, check their calculations. A dead Egyptian woman, a mysterious coffin, a vehicle for traveling to the stars, a specific direction with regard to known constellations in the sky, and immortality. They look at each other, and at the lady, and back at each other. A raised eyebrow, a shrug, a gleam, a half smile. It's worth a shot, they agree. While fanciful and a little dramatic, the previous scenario is one way of accommodating what we know of the Egyptian funerary rites and pyramid architecture into a logical narrative. Our technology is starting to imitate the speculations of the pyramidians. From putting our astronauts into a chemically induced state of torpor, where they rest in glass sarcophagi for months or years, like mummies in their tombs, to the general acknowledgement that the pyramids, and even the mastabas before them were aligned with celestial phenomena. These are just the bare bones of the process, however, no pun intended. The complexity of the instructions, prayers, and other symbolism represented by the pyramid texts and the Book of Going Forth by Day indicate that the Egyptians understood the terrible dangers in this type of travel and the need for the traveler to be in perfect spiritual as well as physical condition. The psychological makeup of a modern astronaut is a subject of great concern to NASA and other space agencies, as important as their intellectual and physical condition. To remain in a spacecraft for extended periods of time, for instance, aboard the International Space Station for months or longer, or a Mars mission that may require years of living in space, requires a certain degree of psychological toughness, courage, and reserves of inner strength. One would imagine that none of this would be required of a pharaoh's corpse. But due to the Egyptian concept of the Ka, the Ba, and the various other components of a human being, the death of the body did not imply the complete eradication of identity. Death became a leaving of the earth, and the sense of earth as a stand-in for this world, while the physical remains were left here, like discarded clothing or a butterfly's cocoon. The rest of what constitutes personhood survived in the liminal space between this world and the double world. It is this very liminality that is dangerous, both to the living and the dead. The continued communication or interaction with the dead, in the form of ritual observances, offerings, and the like, reinforce the memory of the dead among the living, the way it is usually explained, but also provided a kind of substance or corporeality to the dead, empowering them to function in this liminal space. It was believed that the dead underwent a series of trials on their way to immortal status, the way Catholics used to believe in purgatory, a liminal space between this world and heaven, the sky, where sins were purged until the soul was cleansed and purified. Among the ancient Egyptians, this purgatory state was a series of levels on the way to the circumpolar stars. By participating in this voyage, by assisting the dead pharaoh to make his way through the many levels of the Duat, the underworld, by reciting the right spells and making the right offerings on the right days, implying a certain degree of coordination with the dimension of time and its associated celestial components, the Egyptians rehearsed their own after-death experience. This is paralleled in the Tibetan scripture known as the Bardo Thodo, what popularly has been known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The Tibetan system anticipates a future incarnation, however, and not a state of immortality among the stars. But we can regard it as a kind of functional immortality, since the essential element of the individual returns again and again to inhabit a series of bodies. The most famous reincarnated Tibetan is, of course, the Dalai Lama, whose successor is chosen among children born at a specific time, astrology being an element of this process, and who can identify the previous incarnation's possessions and recognize his friends. The deceased Lama is guided through the various levels of the underworld, called the Bardo, in this case, by the other monks who perform rituals and recite the appropriate scripture, enabling the spirit of the Lama to pass from one stage to the next. The Bardo is the intermediate stage between death and rebirth, and the recitation of the Bardo Thodol is supposed to help the Lama in this intermediate stage as he listens to the instructions of the monks. In New Age circles, both ancient Egypt and Tibet are considered spiritually advanced cultures. and attract tens of thousands of seekers and interested laypersons every year to museums, conferences, seminars, ritual initiations, in the Kalachakra initiation of Tibetan Buddhism, and sales of best-selling books. These are also the two cultures with a very highly articulated concept of the nature of the afterlife, with its multiple levels and characteristics, and the need of the deceased to have prayers recited over them that match these levels and are designed to guide the soul through each obstacle. The 6 levels of the bardo have been characterized as stages or types of consciousness. If we applied this same approach to the Egyptian texts, we may find important new data that will enable us to understand the phenomenon in terms of its manipulation of consciousness. We may also identify the link between these death rituals from very different cultures and the nature of the paleo contact that we propose inspired the Egyptian funerary system. The Egyptian understanding of the nature of the underworld and the identification of the human soul with a divine counterpart underwent changes and modifications from dynastic period to dynastic period. In the 3rd dynasty, the soul of the deceased king was identified with Horus, the falcon-headed god who was a son of Osiris and Isis. It is only with the 5th dynasty that we begin to see a shift from Horus to Osiris, with the deceased king identified as an Osiris, meaning a dead and resurrected god. That may not be particularly relevant to our investigation, as the basic form still applies. The identification of a human being with a god, a process that takes place after death, and the elevation of that human being to the celestial realm. However, since Osiris was identified with the constellation we know as Orion, the orientation of the Great Pyramid to this constellation reflects this changing view. To be sure, only one of the shafts of the Great Pyramid is oriented to Orion. The other shaft is oriented to the circumpolar stars of the northern horizon, which maintains the original focus of the 3rd dynasty step pyramid, the constellation we know as Ursa Major, but which to the Egyptians represented the god Set, was predominant in the early dynasties. Thus, what we may see in the Great Pyramid is not so much a modification of the original concept, but an elaboration of it, a refinement that recognizes the polarity of these two celestial objects and their contribution to the resurrection machine. More recently, it has been suggested that the shafts of the Great Pyramid were not intended to align with either Orion or the pole star specifically, but were designed to form a passageway from one part of the Milky Way to another. The Milky Way was known to the Egyptians as the Winding Waterway, often associated with the goddess Nut. Egyptologists are divided as to whether Nut represents the Milky Way or just the path of the ecliptic. She is usually portrayed stretched out over the earth, with her head in the west, where she devours the sun every evening, and her womb in the east, where she gives birth to the sun every morning. She is usually depicted nude and covered with stars. There are many references to the Milky Way as Winding Waterway in the pyramid texts. There, the dead pharaoh is said to cross the Winding Waterway to take his place among the circumpolar stars. This would seem to lend credence to the idea that the shafts in the Great Pyramid were aligned to capture the light of the Milky Way, to provide the sea on which the sarcophagus would sail. Either way, the scholars agreed that the shafts are there to provide a passage to the stars. Thus, the pyramids have a celestial component, and it is not possible to understand ancient Egyptian religion, inseparable from ancient Egyptian science, mathematics, and architecture, without it. The so-called Tomb of Osiris illustrates this concept perfectly. A replica, located 114 feet deep below the surface of the earth at the shaft of Osiris at Giza. It is a plain stone sarcophagus on an island surrounded by the waters of a man-made canal. There are many strange characteristics of the shaft of Osiris, which are noted by Robert Temple, including some quite ancient sarcophagi located on the second level of the three-level construction. The tomb was subject to some devastation and vandalism in the post-World War II era, with its 4 columns or pillars destroyed, and the sarcophagus damaged as well. But the overall design of the tomb is clearly evident even today. This is a feature that is largely unknown in Western architecture, aside from the simple orientation of Catholic churches, which usually have the altar in the east. Asian architectural forms often represent beliefs surrounding celestial associations, such as feng shui in China and Vastu in India. Of course, it has been shown that ancient Western monuments, such as Stonehenge in England, as well as some of the earthen monuments left behind by the mound builder culture in North America, are also celestially oriented or aligned. What usually goes unnoticed in these cases is the possibility that they too were designed with the idea of celestial resurrection in mind. Normally, edifices like Stonehenge were believed to be erected solely for the purpose of marking the seasons through solar and lunar observations, and possibly as sites for ritual observances. But there has been little thought given to the possibility that they also were used to transport the dead to the heavens. Egyptologists often characterize the pyramids as a refinement of the primeval mound concept in Egyptian religion. According to one of the creation stories, a mound appeared in the midst of the primeval ocean, and from this mound the god Atum emerged to begin the process of creation. In other recensions, Atum is himself identified as the mound. Thus the mound already had spiritual and narrative significance for the ancient Egyptians that perhaps predated the erection of the first pyramid at Saqqara. William F. Romaine makes just this point when he writes of the azimuths to the other world he discovered among the orientation of burials and mound builder sites in North America. His findings reveal that many of the Hopewell sites are aligned to points of solar and lunar significance, and that the burials were often oriented to the moon and the western sky. Unfortunately, the mound builder culture did not leave behind any written records, and all that remains are the mounds themselves and whatever objects and artifacts have been discovered buried within them. The orientation of many of the sites can be determined, however, and they are startlingly consistent in their attention to astronomical alignments, whether these were burial sites, as already noted, or mounds of ceremonial significance, such as the famous Serpent Mound in southern Ohio. It is sobering to realize that most Americans are totally unaware of the remains of these ancient cultures right beneath their feet, remains that are in some cases, the Adena culture, older than even Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. The stratification of the Egyptian underworld, the Duat, probably did not take place in any formal way until the 18th dynasty, when the Book of Gates became known. This text shows the underworld as having 12 gates, which the deceased must pass before attaining immortality among the stars. The Book of Gates appeared long after the Great Pyramid was built, long after the end of the Pyramid era. It reflects in a textualized form what the pyramids did in architecture, and is basically a commentary on the earlier funerary practices that gave rise to the pyramids themselves. The number 12 is probably more of a symbolic device, representing the 12 hours of darkness or night, than it is a literal view of the nature of the duat. However, it could also be seen as the imposition of ideas of order and symmetry onto the more primeval concept of the underworld. And this type of refinement may reveal a deeper, or at least more contextual understanding of what the underworld is composed and how travel through the topology of the afterlife is achieved. It is possible, let us entertain the idea anyway, that early impressions of the underworld were that it was a chaotic place, whose symmetry or order was not immediately apparent, reflective of a human inability to determine the lines and planes of that otherworldly dimension, but that with continued exposure to it, the vague outlines of the system were gradually understood and perceived. The deceased pharaoh first would face the prospect of securing passage to the underworld in a craft of some kind. This is depicted as a boat that would carry him and a number of gods and assistants on the journey through the 12 gates. At each gate, he would be confronted by 2 gods and a serpent. He would have to know the names of these 3 in order to pass through the gate. This system has persisted down the centuries. It is reflected in the similar method known to Merkaba mysticism of passing through the 7 levels of the heavens to reach the throne of God. Each level has its name and its guardians, and these also must be known in advance. These levels contain all sorts of obstacles, such as lakes of fire, fire-breathing serpents, and of course, the dreaded Apophis, a giant serpent that was the adversary of Ra. Even Set, considered by this time to be the enemy of Osiris and Horus, would be enlisted to fight Apophis during the pharaoh's journey through the underworld. It was believed to be the blood of Apophis that colored the sky red in the morning and in the evening, as Set wounded him while protecting Ra's solar bark. This may be a survival of the cult of Set that had persisted in Egypt until the worship of Osiris became the dominant religion. At the 5th gate, the deceased heart is weighed. If it is heavier than a feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth, then the deceased is devoured. And so it goes. Why did the Egyptians anticipate so many hardships and dangers after death? Why did they emphasize the need for meticulous preparation of the body and the soul of the deceased? In short, why were these rituals needed, and what were they imitating? We have already pointed out the visual similarity between a corpse in its sarcophagus and an astronaut in the state known as torpor, a kind of